because I asked her what I should call her, and she said, I think this is in the book maybe, that she said, call me what you like. I'm not a dog and I won't come when you call. So I began calling her the Night Mother, so I would have just something to write down in my journals and stuff, you know. How do you break off the story that isn't you and the stories that came from your family or your culture that kind of guide your sense of who you are and possibility for yourself? And how do you kind of return to the scenes of the crime where damage was caused by traumatic events and extract the power that got stuck there? Important is for people to realize that not everybody's going to find the same way in at all. And that's one of the things I try to do in 6 ways, is go like, there's a ton of ways here in, and it's not that these are all things you have to learn before you can begin. It's like, find one that'll let you in, right? That's why I think of them as entries.
Hello, dear listeners. I hope you're well, and welcome to episode 31 of the Spirit Box. And for this episode, we have an awesome guest for you in the form of Aidan Wachter. Aiden is the author of the brilliant 6 Ways, which is a collection of approaches and entries for practical magic. It's not a system, grimoire, or belief system. The focus is on the development of healthy spirit ecologies with a decidedly animist bent. We'll be talking through that book, and we'll be touching towards the end of the show on his new book, Weaving Faith, Hypersigils, Changing the Past and Telling True Lies, which is available at the end of August 2020. Now you can find the links for that book and all Aiden's work in the show notes. He's just launched the podcast as well, so be sure to subscribe to that. Link again in the bottom of the show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, in the YouTube notes, whatever that's actually called. It's there. Just trust me, it's there. Look down, scroll down. There you go. Right, we talk spirits, dirt sorcery, and rural life. Aiden takes us through a frankly beautiful, moving experience he had through his work in deep trance states. We discuss the influence society has on the self and how solid praxis and discernment can really help one insulate oneself against that which does not serve you. And looking at the way the world is at the moment, this is good stuff. This is good stuff to look at, good medicine. In the Plus show, we discuss Aiden's encounters with the Man in Black, which is frankly fucking terrifying. We discuss luminous threads of attachment and severing those attachments, and practices to protect oneself from the negative entities out there, the old parasitical hungry spirits. We also chat about the occulture obsession with lineage and authenticity of magical practices, and to that end we discuss the consistent methods and tools that have allowed people to dip into ancient magical currents throughout time. And if you want to hear that, click the Patreon link in the show notes and come join the team. But before we get into all of that, a quick thank you to Lonnie Scott of Weird Web Radio for making the introduction to set up the show. Thank you, Lonnie. I owe you a pint. Check out Lonnie's show. It's awesome. He's got some fantastic guests, including both of the people you're about to hear now. 2 for 1. Anyway, enjoy. Aidan Wachter, you're very welcome to the Spirit Box. I'm hugely grateful to have you on the show. Lonnie Scott has kindly made the introduction to help orientate some of the listeners. Can you tell us a bit about who you are and what your practice is?
Sure. I first kind of started thinking about magic in 1982 and got serious about it in 1987, I guess. And most folks know me as a talismanic jeweler. I got into the jewelry thing in the 90s, dropped it for a long time, and then returned in 2012 and just retired from that last year. And then I've written 2 books, one that has been out for a couple of years called 6 Ways, and one that just is in the process of being released right now called Weaving Fate. And yeah, I'm kind of an animist sorcerer, magic person, whatever term you want to use. I'm not picky.
So. That bit you kind of said at the end about kind of whatever term you want to use and not picky. As we were just saying earlier, that really jumped out at me from your book, and I love the language that you use. That it kind of it feels magical, but it feels kind of raw as well, and it feels kind of elemental and meat and bone and all stuff like that. It kind of yeah, no, it just, and I'm sure you hear this a lot, but it really kind of it landed. And talking about stuff that landed, there's a statement used at the start of the book where you or a phrase, and I'm paraphrasing now, but religion is an offshoot of sorcery, and sorcery slash animism is the root of all culture. I broadly agree with this statement. I think it's pretty accurate, but can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, it's where this came from for me is the idea that we get a lot when we're looking at primitive religion, primitive culture, primitive what we would now lump together mostly as sorcery, or if we're not talking, or shamanism, or all these terms that are highly related to each other. It's usually viewed as this is kind of some kind of de-evolution of a higher thing. So it's kind of like religion gone bad in some way, or that it's just really kind of people who don't know any better, right? And I think this is really kind of specious and incredibly bizarre, because we can see that some form of these practices have existed in essentially every culture that we know anything about up until fairly recent times. And it's my thinking that if there is something that kind of leads to that development of culture, or leads to these kind of leaps of kind of consciousness, it's the things that we could again broadly lump into the categories of magic or sorcery, or again shamanism. There's not as much difference in my mind as there is in kind of the academic views of these things.
Well, it's interesting that you touch on the academic view of things. So that's kind of my next talking point, is like I find kind of like Western magic and kind of occult culture is, it has a real kind of quite heavy vein of academic culture in it, you know, both in practice and kind of perceived authority, that it's kind of almost PhD driven in a lot of ways. And you know, that there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it seems to kind of there's also a little bit of, I think, not looking at people who are just practicing, you know, who have their lived experience in practice. That it kind of, the academic side of it kind of, you know, which makes sense in terms of kind of the Western mindset and kind of being empirical and kind of, you know, ever since the Enlightenment, where it's study focused, and magic has a tradition of being study focused, right? You know, there's a basis in science. But one of the themes that I found in your book that I really liked, and again, kind of one of the core principles that you built this on, was the idea of gut feeling over logic. You know, that in relation to the liminal. You know, and that I thought was really powerful. You know, because it really indicated that the individual's relationship with the other, that there wasn't a kind of you didn't have to go to a lodge. You know, you didn't have to be part of a coven. That you could, you know, to a degree, self-initiate. You know,
right,
about your own practice. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's, and I totally hear what you're saying. It's an interesting thing, because we can see that in the West, and especially in the Western kind of what we think of as Western esoteric tradition, we can see what was going on with the Golden Dawn folks. We can see the very heavy influences in what came out of like the folklore societies. We can see this in kind of the Wicca and witchcraft stuff, a lot of which came out of things like in the US, the Society of Creative Anachronism. the Covenant of the Goddesses initial thing was coming out of a Morris dancing group. And we can see these things. Yeah, so we can see these things as being driven to kind of public view via folks that have, in some sense, an academic background, right? And I think that then can become kind of codified, right? And again, there's nothing actually wrong with that. It's just one angle in.
Yeah.
But if we look to kind of the raw experience, and this is kind of a weird one, but if we're moving the work outside of the temple, and outside of the magic circle of protection, and if we're moving it outside of the conception that we need to bring in these kind of good, benevolent, angelic powers to protect us from the harsher ones that can nonetheless help us out down here, right? Which is a lot of Western ceremonial magic. And we move to things that look more like what we see in the African traditional religions, a lot of shamanism, a lot of indigenous practices that, again, they get defined in lots of different ways, but that bridge between things like shamanism or spirit healing and sorcery is not as cut and dried as people often think, I think. It's just missing a lot. That if you haven't actually gotten, I said in response to my friend Matt Oren had a post, and I can't remember the whole thing about it, but I jumped on one piece, and it was about kind of people's fear of practicing, and kind of people being told as they come in that if they don't do it exactly right and exactly by the book, that these horrible, terrible mistakes will happen. And I responded that but terrible mistakes are where you really learn, right? Because it's like you think you know how to control the things that you're calling up, but until they actually get out of control outside of the circle, which does happen, can you deal with that? Because that's a different game. That's something, if it's already out of the box, how do you do with it? And I think that the reality is that most of what we experience in our life is outside of that box, is outside of that circle. And to me, again, it kind of, I was talking to Douglas at the What Magic Is This podcast about this. There's a very urban aspect to Western ceremonial magic, even though it's something we wouldn't really recognize as urban, right? Urban London in John Dee's time is not anything most of us would refer to as urban. But it still has that. And it's this very educated, very controlled, very scientific approach into something that, in my experience, is incredibly kind of primordial and raw and experiential. That, again, so much of what I've experienced doesn't fit any of the kind of correspondence-based approaches.
Yeah, I really see where you're going with that, and I think you're bang on with that, and it really came across in your book. Like I grew up in the countryside, like I grew up on the side of a mountain in the west of Ireland, where like the power and the water went a couple of times a month, so like I know what real rural means, and kind of, I know what pitch black night means, that sense, and a real sense of what the landscape is. And when people talk about a haunted landscape, I know exactly what that means. And I felt that in your book. I felt that connection to the land, being part of the land and being part of the life that lives there, like we often talk about things like, say, one of the things I talk about how travel is magic, the adventuring spirit, the travel is magic, and how you change, on that kind of quest type thing. But there's a bit as well that I think we miss when we talk about like some of the kind of trappings of rural life, or like being part of a garden, growing stuff, looking after animals, and kind of that cycle of kind of, you give and you take, and that taking might be fruit, it might be meat, it might be eggs, it might be whatever, but it's part of that cycle of a relationship. And I kind of like, when I was reading through your work, I kind of felt that idea of, it's almost kind of like it's that symbiotic relationship with spirit, as you would have like a symbiotic relationship with land.
it's a bit of a clunky metaphor, but you know where I'm going with it.
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. Yeah. You know, it's interesting because it probably, I guess it was in 2011 is that I've traveled all over and I've lived in many places, primarily in North America, but I've, freight hopped thousands of miles and
cool. Awesome.
That kind of stuff. But in 2011, my wife and I moved to a very rural part of Tennessee. And this was the most rural county of Tennessee. And we were in the part that the locals referred to when you tell them where we live. They're like, oh, you live down there in the boonies. This is a county that is immense. It has less than 10,000 people in it. And the person that's telling you about this is in a town that has 600 people in it. So we're talking deep rural. And it was there that I got chickens and goats and all of that, and go, okay, your relationship to the spirit of animals changes when you start slaughtering them. And I don't think in a bad way, right? It's one of those really interesting conversations that comes up now because there's an assumption. I get this a lot because I have animals, and even though I'm not harvesting them for the most part now, people go, well, why don't you have the respect that you have for your dogs to your chickens? And it's very weird to me because you go, why do you think I don't? It has to happen. If I have too many roosters, the girls get all torn up and they kill each other, blind each other. So part of my job, if I'm choosing to be in that, is to be the one to go, you're not okay here, and so I'm going to eat you, and I'm going to do that in the most conscientious and respectful way as possible. And I think that that's something that is lost now for most people. It's an interesting thing, but I do think that we're at a weird intersection where there is like I was talking to somebody again about a kind of witchcraft thing, and they were asking me about my take on kind of Wicca and witchcraft. And I think they're beautiful things, but they were like, well, what doesn't work for you about ritual? And I said, well, my connection is kind of what I think of as almost like a early Neolithic, Paleolithic connection energetically. And this is this agricultural religion, right? They're like, well, it's not. I'm like, then why are you making dollies out of sheaves of wheat? This is totally Neolithic.
And the wheel of the year,
and the beer and all of this stuff. It's like, whereas the spirits that I have interaction with, they present to me, which I understand is part me, primarily as more hunter-gatherer types. And so that whole structure doesn't super make sense to me. And I think that it's just interesting. I think that there's so many different ways in. It's not saying that's bad. It's just, it's not mine. But I mean, I think I've diverged greatly from where we started, but I'm not even sure where that was to get back there.
It's all good. We can talk about what we want. In the book, you describe trance as having 3 states, and in the deep trance state, you're fully immersed in the other world, and you interact with its inhabitants. Can you describe those interactions and maybe take us through one of the ones that really affected you? If you're comfortable with
that. This is where I get funky and weird, and people go like, he's one of those, because then they start talking and you go, okay. So see who wants to be involved. I about 4 years ago now, 2015, 5 years ago now, time flies. I was walking in the West in very deep trance. And to me, how that works is like, I can go in different levels. And so I can actually do work in the West while I'm not even aware of kind of landscape, I would say. And then there's a point where I'm aware of landscape, but it's a little bit ghostly. And then there's a point where I start touching things and there's a tactile feedback. So It's one of the things I think I mention in 6 Ways, is that like, if you can get to the place where if it's raining or drizzly or whatever, and you can touch the wet leaves, there's something in there that'll drop you all the way in. That's been my experience. And so once I'd found this particular zone, I found a barrow that was like what you would see in your part of the world. And I was near it, and I didn't go to it. I wasn't there, but this spirit showed up that was in the form of a very austere-looking woman with straight black hair, and who was kind of floating above the ground, just an inch or so, kind of typical apparition thing. And when I'm in that when I'm all the way in that depth, I'm not really thinking normally, right? It's like, this is very normal. There's nothing odd about it. Even when things get really, truly bizarre, there's no part of me that's like referencing kind of my day-to-day life. And so that was fine. And I spoke to her, and she didn't respond, but she kind of made clear in some way that I should follow her, and headed back to this barrow that I had passed. And the barrow was open, and I went in, and it was very dark, but there was a small fire, and there was another kind of female spirit that I couldn't see super clearly, but and she was, through the process of this interaction, kind of made clear that she was actually in the barrow. She was stuck in the barrow, not in a bad way. That was just her place, right? And over the next several months, I visited that space and interacted with these female forms that all looked very similar, and then this barrow, who I call the Night Mother now, because I asked her what I should call her, and she said, I think this is in the book maybe, that she said, call me what you like. I'm not a dog, and I won't come when you call. So I began calling her the Night Mother, so I would have just something to write down in my journals and stuff, And she showed me, as did these women who I call the sisters now, all of this stuff that was dealing with kind of fear of death and the reality of death from the death side. So they don't have any sense of being embodied, of having been embodied. Their forms change very regularly in particular patterns. And when I've asked them about that, they're like, this is just what we do with your mind so we can interact. Like, they're really clear. Like, this is what you're seeing is not anything that's really particularly relevant to our reality. This is just a way for us to interact with you. And anyway, I visited them for a couple of years. And at one point, and I know I've talked about this before somewhere on a podcast, but either with Lonnie maybe or with Andrew, I don't know. At some point, and this would have been in October, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I guess, I went in, and the sisters were all waiting for me, which is the first time that had ever happened. Like, there was a bunch of them. There were maybe like 10 or 15 of them. And they said, we need to do something different with you now. And this is the first time they'd kind of taken the lead, other than kind of showing me something. And I was very comfortable with it. And I said, okay, that's fine. And they did this whole process that once they began, they changed shape, and they switched from being these kind of human apparitions to being these little flecks of golden light. And there were hundreds of thousands of them, was the sense of them. And they swarmed like bees, and they spoke in my head. At this point, it was really clear it was in my head, in a very odd language, because they were talking to themselves as we, us, something like that. They were speaking to them of themselves as collections. And once they switched into that shape, that form, they were like, we want to do some things to you so that you can interact with us more like we do. Mm-hmm. And this was an incredibly invasive procedure. It wasn't painful, but it was incredibly intense, where they were opening me up and doing stuff inside of me. And I've had versions of that before, but this was very different. And at a certain point, it became incredibly sexual for me. And at that point also, my perception of myself was that I was female. So this was a very overwhelming kind of sensory experience.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not sure how I should feel about having this sexual response to this, because I don't even know really what you're doing.
Yeah.
And there was this mass humor that came out of this collective that was essentially said, that's just the only way you really know how to process kind of sensory data that is this intense,
right?
That isn't painful. Mm-hmm. So it's fine that that's what's happening for you, but that's not really what we think is happening, right? But it makes sense to us that you've experienced that. But anyway, and this transformative process went on that time, and then went on several times over the coming weeks. Not the same, but where they continued to kind of integrate me, and I would be able to have this conversation from perceptually inside that kind of hive mind, that collective mind. I was part then of we, us, kind of, rather than me being there. Not 100%, but I was definitely able to kind of, I could get their vibe. And shortly after that, it was about 3 weeks after this started, I got a call that my son was on life support in the hospital. And I went back in. And when I went into trance this time, it was the fastest way I'd ever gotten to that place. And when I popped in, they were all there, and they were like, sorry, but this is what we've been doing with you, mm-hmm. because this was coming, and there's things that you can do to help him.
Okay.
In his passage. And so that went on for 2 days. And then he was, able to move on. That is the most extreme case that I've had of all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. But there's a way in which it also explains kind of my experience of it, that it's not me going, I want you to do this to me to make me more like this.
Yeah.
It's developing relationships, and over time, those spirit relationships will offer to make changes that they think are beneficial.
Right.
And I have enough trust in them at this point to go, I'm okay with that, or that I need more information, or I need to understand it better. And after the fact, I'll see why. It's like development of some tool set or some skill set, Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's part of, like, people go like, this guy really acts like this shit is provably real. And it's like, well, I'm not saying that you can prove any of this stuff, but for me, it's provably real.
Yeah.
I've had more than enough experience to accept that for me, this is real.
Well, thank you for sharing such an incredibly personal story. That's really powerful. I just appreciate you sharing that. And I do get what you're saying in terms of it being provably real to me, and that's something I've only really gotten my head around in, like, the last couple of years, for looking back at kind of like my own journey and kind of into this space. I mean, I started with, looking at Buddhism and kind of, that kind of stuff when I was 15, which, growing up in Catholic Ireland was obviously very radical. But I was also, I also worked an awful lot of pendulum, and I still do. I've been working with that since I was 15. So I was delighted to see you talk about pendulums in the book. I was like, finally,
somebody's got to bring them back.
It's always about
so good.
Yeah,
they're so good.
Pendulums, yeah.
They're so good.
That was awesome. But I like what I had, and I've talked about this in the podcast before. But what I had, kind of my first recognition of this dream was real. This dream was a real interaction. Happened a couple of years ago. You've seen some of my photographic work.
Absolutely.
So as in my travel photographer career, I'd look for certain stories and go off and shoot them. In younger days, it could be for 6 months at a time.
Right.
Later life, it's a little bit shorter than that. I haven't got the appetite for the road as much.
Right.
But it was about 4 years ago. Went off to Delhi to shoot some work in relation to sites related to the jinn from Travelog. And before I went, I had a really quite vivid dream. It was unsettling. I was in a real kind of Sufi scene in a place that I actually know now where that place was. It's an actual shrine in Delhi, and I ended up going there and photographing it. And every Thursday night, in this place called Nuzamuddin Aliyah, which is this really it's kind of the foremost Sufi shrine in Delhi. It's a beautiful place. There's really quite vibrant, ecstatic music. And I was kind of there in my dream, I kind of looked to my left, and one of the Sufis turns and looks at me, except it's not a human, it's not a living face, it's a skull face, kind of rotten face with a snake going in out of the eyes, like proper kind of Indiana Jones kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally.
And it was just straight up, don't come here. Right. So I was like, that's definitely rattled my cage. I still went, and I had a kind of a string of experiences that kind of I since then can kind of formulate and go, yeah, I was being messed with, but it still shot the work. But it's taken me that time to kind of realize that interaction was real, and it was real to me. I can't prove that. I can't qualify it to anybody. But it's that kind of acceptance of kind of what's real to you that I think is hugely important. And it goes back to that bit when you're talking about gut law, your gut versus logic,
yes.
And that kind of ability to discern between the two, and I really get a feel from that from your book. It's like teaching discernment, it's honing your sensitivity about kind of what you're interacting with and what's interacting with you. And again, I just, I love how accessible it is. I made the mistake as a young man of picking up Crowley and trying to, with kind of a fledgling interest in magic, pick up Crowley and go, I can't even get to the end of the page.
Oh no, absolutely. I had the exact same experience.
I'm sorry, Marco, if you're listening. It's always been very hard for me to kind of to penetrate and understand what's going on. And like I'm very kind of visual in how I learn, and kind of I absorb information. It's no surprise that I do photographic work in that regard. But I found that kind of that, I guess, occulted language, heavy in kind of classical metaphor and just extraordinarily difficult to understand what's going on.
I have the same experience with that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing too, because I think I have, and this ties into the jewelry thing, is when I started making jewelry, my friend Mark and his wife Pam, we met by random encounter where which was really just a straight up hardcore spirit-led thing. I was told, you get out of bed right now, even though you're terribly hungover and it's too early, and you go to this place right now. And they were there, and there were these tatted up Buddhist magicians, and it was very clear who I was supposed to talk to, and we became close friends. But I picked up the jewelry thing very, very fast. And what I learned from that really began to make sense of my magical approach, which is I'm incredibly tactile. I want to do the thing, and that's part of what comes along. And there's a description of, I think, in the on consecration section, that is really like, to me, if people would do that a lot till they found kind of that's where I start to get information. It's like, even in here, I'll walk in and start collecting things, as this is where I do a lot of the work that I do. And maybe that's, I've got my father died recently, and I got the family heirloom whale teeth, and the whale teeth have got a particular signature to them that is not the signature a la 777 or something. It's like there is a life current that is tapped into those things that I can touch in a way that can kind of guide some of what I do, you know. I don't know how else to describe that one, but and so I see that. I think that it's one of the things that I think is important, is for people to realize that not everybody's going to find the same way in at all. And that's one of the things I try to do in 6 ways, is go like, there's a ton of ways here in, and it's not that these are all things you have to learn before you can begin. It's like, find one that'll let you in, right? That's why I think of them as entries.
Right.
It's like, find 1 or 2 entries that you can use, and then see if you can do all of the magic that you need to do in your life with that, and see what that leads to.
I really get that, you know. And you know, you were talking about working with skulls, you know, again, that was another big kind of bullseye for me, because I do that as well, you know, but I've never learned that from anywhere, you know. I've never kind of read that from anywhere, but and it's only with skulls I've found, you know. I have a very large seal skull that I found on the beach in northwest Scotland, and a dog skull and a rabbit skull and a couple of bird skulls. And when I cast a circle, like, or what I do, whatever my version of that is,
whatever that is,
you know, it's like, that's what goes in my kind of my elemental corners. And, you know, and I'm thinking about, you know, the seal is more water, you know, the bird is more
absolutely
air, you know, and that's it. Yeah. So it is just, you know, I don't want to flatter you too much, but I really enjoy that.
That's okay, I'll take it.
Exactly. But I just got that kind of the gut feeling, the connection with the elements in their most, you know, absolute form. You know, that like the contours of the bird's skull that's designed to go through the air. You know, the shape of the seal, like the how that their body and bone is bent to that environment. You know, you know, and that just kind of, I can feel it. You know,
and I get that too. I have a couple of bird skulls, and the thing that is amazing to me about bird skulls, and I'll just see if this resonates to you, is when we think about air and we think about all of the things about air, and then you pick up an owl skull or something, and there's nothing there.
No, it's so
like
crazy.
There's nothing to it. You know, and then nobody else other than you will probably see this, and then you pick up the sperm whale tooth, and it weighs like 2 pounds.
Yeah.
Right, because this is this many ton animal. What an interesting reality, right? And that's, I think, the thing that I'm always after is, if this stuff is real, then what do you need all of the kind of crazy layers of that we add onto it? And it's not to say that doesn't help, but I know that it works for some people. One of the things that my wife brought up to me early on, before I started writing the book, but when I was talking to people about magic that were coming to me for talismanic work, and sometimes we would talk about some of the questions and things, and she said to me, one of the things that you do that is really important is that you are kind of giving folks permission to do the things that make sense to them in a culture that primarily wants to tell you, no, you should do it this way, because this is the right way, this is the proven way, this is the safe way, this is the intelligent way. If you knew better, if you were better educated. And again, I think this stuff is so much of the body that some of that will work for some people.
Yeah, you know, and to kind of to build on that as well. I mean, you talk about, you know, we're not designed for these kind of hyper stressed states, you know, and it's these states that we find we're always in. You know, we're in these constant states of anxiety, you know, wondering kind of like, okay, how do I get the next rent payment, mortgage payment, you know, why don't I look like those people I see in this way, and all that kind of body image stuff, and all the kind of different complexities and different layers of anxiety and stress that we are tuned into to the external world. But it's down. I mean, for me, again, it comes down to that kind of stuff. Is that like no one really wants that? It's not our natural state. I mean, it's you know, like it's you know, there's nobody out there kind of going, yeah, do you know what? I kind of really like this. You know, this total rat race world where I have no choices. I can't really.
I'm enjoying the low level panic.
Just kind of happy to have my heart rate just constantly pumping away, you know, and like, you know, that we're not no one's enjoying it, you know, and that's one of the reasons kind of when I look at the kind of the world of what's happening in the world all over the world, and you know, in the States, particularly the eyes of the world are on the States, and it's like there's all this polarization. Everyone's kind of at each other's throats, and you got one side who wants to preserve the way it is, the other side wants to take it to another way, and it's like something else has been born. You know, something's happening. You know, there's change, there's flux, and I'm really interested to kind of see where that goes. But fundamentally, you know, I hope and I pray for something that doesn't replace one structure with another structure, that are both equally unpleasant in just different ways, you know. And it's,
absolutely,
and it's that kind of freedom that to express yourself, to explore your relationship with the multiple layers of our own consciousness and the full kind of spectrum of reality around us, that I really like, you know, how you describe that, you know, going like, this is not your natural state. It is not you. You're not the person who is bricking it every month about whatever bills they got to pay or whatever they got to do in their job that is stressing them out. There's another reality. There's a deeper reality, you know, that is only one aspect of who you are. And I think that's a really important thing, you know. And there's a it kind of made me think that there's a healer in you as well, because of what you're describing. You know, you're kind of going, it's okay, it's hard, but do these things, and it's going to take that down. It's going to take you away from it.
I would agree with that. And it's interesting because I think that's what I get from my allies. Is my allies were very clear when I began making jewelry in 2012 again. They were like, this is beneficial work, and it will help both the individuals who get the stuff, and it helps the overall thing. And I didn't really understand that at the time, but over time I began to kind of get that sense. And I definitely have that idea that it's, again, I think we're in this period of zero permission, at least in the United States. Like, you have to be left all the way like this. And if you say one wrong word, you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Or you have to be right the same way. One wrong word, you're not good enough, right? And that's just an extreme expression of what I think goes on culturally here right now. And so I think it is important to really kind of come out and go, this is not how we were, how we came about. There's nothing about this that is that. And so we're not used to it. If we look at kind of the very strange disease vectors that are building up, we're not going to get used to it, because that's not getting it. There's no piece of that is getting better.
Yeah, true.
And so to me, there is a question that is really interesting, which is, how do we shift that, if for nothing else, for ourselves, to, like you say, to kind of drop that energy, to realize like this crazy discontent way beyond what the Buddhists were talking about, right? This is not dukkha. This is a whole new level, or it's dukkha squared or something. It's not natural. It's not you. So you don't have to take that piece of it on. And instead you can try and go, okay, well, how do I build a life that makes sense? Even given the scenario that I'm in. And are there aspects, and this is one of the things that I think magic did for me, is it made me question what I did for work. Like eventually it's like, okay, if I know these things are true, why am I doing this thing that is causing me so much stress? And caused me to kind of, and my wife, to really radically downshift our expectations and our earnings to go like, okay, we would rather be much closer to poor, though I wouldn't put myself in that camp, but have time and a lot less stress. And that's, I mean, that's independent of magic. It's important, I think, independent of magic, but for magicians in particular, when we're trying to churn this other reality sometimes into the churn of the kind of madness of the modern world, it can get peculiar, you know. It's an interesting thing, but I definitely think that there's a huge healing potential to magic. And it is through a kind of, in my experience, and most people I know, kind of a difficult road. It's not an easy path, because it's experiential and because it's individual and because it does require, if you ask the allies to help you get through your shit, they will do that.
The gloves come off.
The gloves come off.
Yeah.
And there's like, okay. And it's funny. I mean, I've had that experience that is common to a lot of different shamanic traditions of going in and having your allies cut you to pieces and remove all your bones and burn a bunch of shit up and put you back together. And it's extreme. And even though that I never sensed that as being particularly painful, the effects of it were severe. It wasn't a gentle ride. It's like, okay, you come out of that and you go, okay, I need to write that down and I need to remember that happened for at least the next year. Because something's changing. Something just changed. And now the rest of my life is going to reorganize if I am attentive. But if I'm not, there's going to be terrible clashes as I try and do tomorrow like I did yesterday, because I'm not the same person.
And that makes an awful lot of sense, you know, and kind of as you rightly asserted, it's like when you start this journey, you know, at some stage you're going to be faced with a question, and it's a blunt question. It's a yes or no answer. Are you for real? And if you say yes without being for real, you're going to get a kicking. You know, that is going to happen. That before me reading through how you describe your journey and what your kind of, you know, recommendations to people in terms of like, this is what I do, take what you need, and, you know, and do you. It just really came across. You're telling people you got to go deep, you got to practice, and you got to do the work. But here's how you do it in a really digestible way. You know, it's like I get what you're talking about, you know, and like, you know, you at the start of the conversation, you were talking about people following kind of magical practice, like in this absolutely resolute, explicit way. I think you talk about it in the book. Actually, it's one of your footnotes is talking about kind of like that it was above and below rooms. So it was like there's 9 steps. Right. It's like, well, how big are these steps? Because that's you need at least 18 steps for it to be down. You know, and I get that. That's kind of exactly the kind of shit that would come into my head. You know,
absolutely.
What size are the steps now? Are we talking breeze blocks or bricks? You know,
exactly, exactly.
You know, so that bit of kind of like paint your own landscape and then journey. Here's what you do when you get there, but paint it yourself. I think is really valuable. But when we talk about that kind of that world of just like the hyper stress, the consistent exposure to stress, it's also that consistent exposure just to stimuli, to shallow, consistent stimuli, you know,
Yes.
and that's where that real work starts, because you're talking about shutting that down and, you know, moving away from that and going into trance, proper meditation practice. It's really, really hard. If you've got a lot,
Yes.
you know, if you have a lifetime of being exposed to media, to shut down. I mean, we're so used to going into trance in front of a TV or in front of a screen.
Exactly.
You know, but to do it to ourselves is really challenging. You know,
and that's a good point. My friend Ren Zapotek, who teaches on animism, she talks about that. She's like, trance isn't hard. Trance is happening all the time. You're doing that on Netflix, you're doing that on your Instagram feed, you're doing that on your phone. It's getting into a trance that is actually in some way helpful or beneficial, you know. And I think that's really true, because we kind of, there's a way that we kind of are entranced by what our society is producing, right? It's this constant thing. And it ties into that thing that we were talking about before, that beyond right or left, or even beyond kind of what any one person, unless you're really talking, you know, theoretical level that most people aren't talking about, beyond capitalism, there is a thing that I believe that modern culture, like if there's like a sub-spirit to it, part of it is about distraction and implementing stress on people and implementing stress on environments. Because it makes it very difficult to function intelligently and to be well enough to function intelligently, because that's kind of a critical key, right? You've got to be reasonably okay before you start making good decisions. This doesn't mean you have to be fixed, because if you're after that, it's never coming, as far as I can tell. But you do have to be able to take enough space and go, okay, I'm going to figure out which pieces of my life don't work for me, and I'm going to try and get as much distance from those as possible. And then I'm going to see if I can start upping the signal on the stuff that does work for me, right? And that's really the root to me of kind of practical magic, which puts me kind of at odds with a lot of people that are really seeing it as strictly, obviously magical operations. But if you can use magical practice to reduce stress and kind of clarify your head enough to go, oh, that thing that I'm chasing, I don't want. I talk about this more in the new book, but there's a lot of the things that, most of the things I think that we want in the modern West, there's no reason why we as individuals would want them. They're just presented as the thing you want. So constantly that even, well, maybe I don't need to be as rich as Kanye or something, but I need to be rich. It's like, really? Like, if you could just pay your bills for the next 60 years, you'd still need to be rich? Because I'd be good with that. You know?
I mean, it's you know, it's that bit about kind of self-recognition. You know, when you start to kind of go, are my values mine? Or what I value, do they actually belong to me and come from me, or actually do they belong to a marketing team? You know, and you know, do they belong to kind of a transient trend? Like, so it's again, it's part of that centering bit, and you talk about it in what do you call it? How you free yourself from your past, you forgive yourself from your past, and
the reclaiming right stuff.
The retrieval totally. And that to me is there's a societal one there as well. It's not just the kind of the individual relationships; it's our relationship with wider society. You know?
I totally agree with that. I mean, it's an interesting thing, because again, the allies get on me. It's not like they're always there. I'm not like 24/7 channeling or something, but when I'm writing or when I'm doing talks like this, they will come in to go like, this is the piece you should keep in, and that piece is crap. You know, and that right is the thing that they were like, this is kind of the key piece, and not everyone will do it. It's too simple. And it's too potent. And that's the thing that I've gotten from a lot of people who will go like, I tried that thing and it totally fucked my shit up. Like, I'm like, this is a stupid ritual, but he says this is where I should start. I don't get it. And I'm like bawling. And I really don't want to do it again tonight, let alone tomorrow for the rest of the next 30 days or how long. And now I know people that have been doing that for years.
Right.
Because they're like, this is my anchor. This is that thing. I'm going to retract. I'm going to scrape and cut off kind of the tentacles of the everything else. And then I'm going to do that thing and go, I'm all right. I'm good. I fuck up and that's okay. And I am moving on and I'm good. You know, I think that's important.
Yeah, so you think it's hugely important, you know, and like, and again, it's that measuring of oneself against, you know, the impossible, against the unachievable, you know. But when you really when you kind of unpack it, do you really want these things? You know, it's like from the outset, you know, you mentioned Kanye, you know, and it's like from the outside, you're like, well, Kanye's got the life, he's got everything. And then actually kind of you
dig in
and it turns out like there's absolute chaos. There's a lot of pain, and that's playing out in the public eye. You know, I couldn't think of anything worse. You know,
right?
Like, you know, and it's understanding kind of the value in what you have, and I feel that kind of the processes you're describing helps do that to people, send to them.
Yeah.
You know, but also tell them you got a shitload of work to do.
You got a shitload of work to do. It's also interesting because, again, I have this super long view of humanity, right? I don't consider what is considered modern Homo sapiens to be the beginning of humanity at all. And so I think of this like, let's just pick, you know, I always try and pick reasonable numbers. So I'm going to say like 1 million years. For 1 million years, none of this shit mattered to anyone. It was about, do we have water? Do we have shelter? Do we have food? Are we able to keep enough of the kids alive to continue the tribe?
Yeah.
That was it. On the material level, right? But from everything that we can see and what we've learned from kind of survivals or art or whatever, and if you tap into the kind of spirit realms, you get kind of the ability, at least I have, to tap into, I think, deeper levels of kind of human memory. There was this massive interaction with us, with the spirits, with the animals, with the land. And I think the fact that we can tap into that at all now is kind of amazing, considering what's gone on since. But I think if we can kind of do those things, a lot of this stuff begins to fall away. You know, and you go, okay, yeah, I like my stuff, but if the house caught on fire, that's all right.
Yeah.
You know, I could walk away. I'd, you know, let the dog and the cat out and head out. And if we can kind of have that sense that this stuff in our station, in our place is transient, because it all is.
Yeah.
You know, I think we can begin to look at it and go, well, given that all of this is transient, given that we're here for a very short time, given that we're never going to really know the meaning behind every bit of this, well, what do you want to do then? And that, I think, is a really, to me, a hugely potent question in magic. Like, what do you want your life to be like then? What do you not want? And can you come up with a way, and can you use magic in the traditional sense of practical magic to facilitate that? Like, okay, if your job is terrible, well, then get to work and see if you can't conjure something better, or conjure the skill set that allows you to do that, and do the hard work that is required too. That it all can be, it's an integrated thing. It's an integrated life process. Really sense that.
Right. So your new title, so when did the book come out?
It came out as, the ebook came out about a week ago, 10 days ago, and the print book starts shipping on the 31st of August. So it's open for pre-order for another 13 days from when we're recording this, but it'll be shipping shortly.
So firstly, congratulations, you know,
Thank you.
Bringing a new creation into the world. And can you tell us, how does this book build on 6 ways, or is it totally different?
I think they build on each other, though. It's intended to be usable as a standalone,
right?
And it's intended to be really usable as a standalone, though I do kind of put out there that you want to come up with a little bit of protective tools like the stuff we were just talking about. And that can be from my stuff or something like Jason Miller's protection and reversal magic. It doesn't super matter. It doesn't have to be the stuff in 6 ways.
Yeah.
So 6 ways is kind of like a general overview of the ways in that we talked about earlier, right? The find a path or two that you can tap into and then see what you can do with that. It's not that you need the whole toolkit necessarily. You can do a lot with a hammer and a screwdriver. You don't have to have the whole thing. And so it was pretty wide ranging. And Weaving Fade is not wide ranging in that sense at all. It's a very focused collection of practices towards one way of working, which is a journal form of Hypersigil. And it is really a long-term practice that is a way of really kind of doing a lot of the stuff that we talked about. How do you break off the story that isn't you and the stories that came from your family or your culture that kind of guide your sense of who you are and possibility for yourself? And how do you kind of return to the scenes of the crime where damage was caused by traumatic events and extract the power that got stuck there? Because if it's still having an effect, it's because, again, it's one of that attachment concept, right? Yeah. You're anchored to that point when you were 15 and that thing happened to you. And it's an energy leak and it's a problem. And it's this section that deals with that was something that was taught to me by my allies and has proven to be a huge thing for me. Because it is a tool to actually go in and kind of break that hold, extract that power and transform it or that kind of damage and transform it into power that you can use. And so the idea behind Weaving Fade is that it's an overall toolkit that is really primarily 3 tools to do a single kind of work. That you could use the pieces separately, but if you actually want to get the best results from it, they work better as a collection. And it's the best thing that I know for really doing kind of serious changes to our reality that doesn't, in a really consistent way and in a really where we get the most say. It doesn't have a lot of spirit work in this book. This is definitely a little more centered on the person themselves. But yeah, it's the thing that I've been using forms of for a long time to kind of shape my life how I want to, much more than what would look like traditional ritual magic.
I'd say it sounds fantastic. It sounds really interesting. In terms of listeners and kind of the best place to find the title, is it Amazon or
any of the big online retailers have it? So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Adlibris in Scandinavia. The Book Depository works for a lot of places, but yeah, you can get it Amazon UK, all of that stuff.
Well, I'll put the links in the show notes. And in terms of if anybody wants to kind of follow you or see your work, where's the best place to find you?
AidanWachter.com. That's my website. It's got links out to my social media stuff. It's got a new page up for the book if you want to see a little bit more on what that book is. It's got a bit of the introduction there. And it also has the first episode of my podcast, which became live yesterday.
Yeah, I listened to it yesterday. Congratulations.
Thank you. And so that's the main source. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, but slowly trying to extract myself a little bit from those things for all of the reasons we have discussed. Trying to back off a little bit. I've been a little overly involved for the last year or so there. So.
I totally get you. I ditched Facebook about two and a half years ago. So
it's tough because we've got a really active Facebook group. We've got almost 3,000 people in a Facebook group. Tied into Weaving Fade in 6 ways. So that will always be there as long as people. I'm not sure how much I will be there in the long run, and that's really what the podcast was kind of created to do. Is like, okay, I can move at least the Q&A stuff to something that's not tied into a social media platform.
It's a tough one. Kind of when I torched my Facebook presence, I had like 8,000 followers for like my photographic work, but it was that kind of thing that was a dead group anyway, because like, I'd share something, then you got to pay to play and all that kind of stuff. So it's, and people come and see my stuff. It's more of kind of observe and go. It's not so much a conversation. I was joking about this, I think on Gordon White's podcast, that like, I can tell you what flies better on social. Beautiful landscape, dude drinking whiskey out of a skull. I know which one I want to see, but it doesn't always play out.
It's a weird thing. It's a super weird thing. And I had that, the world of social media, and especially kind of magical or occult social media, is very strange. I did, again, when I was making jewelry, that was the thing. It's like I could put pretty cool picture of my jewelry up, and that was, lovely. Now people are must be satisfied with my chickens and my dogs because I'm not making jewelry. But it's very interesting too, because of that weird kind of book thing in the magical world, you write a book and then that opens up this whole other thing, and it's like, that's really weird. Like, why is this the thing that then makes me legit? That's bizarre.
It's a really interesting point.
Super strange. It's like, what the fuck is that? That's not quite right.
And you're not the first person I've heard to say that. Like, there's kind of very experienced magical practitioners going kind of like, okay, so I have to write something before I get taken seriously, and
apparently that is true.
Yeah.
It certainly isn't right, but apparently it is true.
And it's weird as well, because when you look at kind of the different vehicles now that we have to deliver information, like a book is a really useful thing. I say this as an absolute book lover. That's how I can't even deal with ebooks. I need the paper. And I've also got that weird thing. I know you talk about kind of shedding your belongings. Like my books are like.
Oh, I've burned my books. I've burned down the book pile a million times, so I no longer have that problem. I have already. I've already made arrangements with a couple of friends for the ones that I can't actually just throw out into the world. Okay, you're getting my spare when I have to get rid of it. I'm just going to give it to you, and I don't want it back, but I need to know it went somewhere cool.
I get that. It's like knowing that it goes to a good home. I think I could deal with it more. I think it would kind of soften.
That's how I am about my I am about my books and my guitars. I've got a couple guitars I need to shed, and it's like, I need to open that up to my close friends, and if none of them want to buy it, it should be like, okay, then you can put your name in the hat and I'll just send it to you. I need to know it goes to a good home.
I had that thing before, kind of, you lend a book to somebody, even if it's not like something that it's just a story you enjoyed, not particular kind of like, ooh, this is a book that kind of like spoke to me. Just, it's a good story. And getting it back, and it's like the spines in bits. I'm like, how did you read this? This you've destroyed.
What did you do?
What did you do to this?
This nice person.
I trusted you with this book. You've brutalized it, that kind of I still have that. I got some work to do there, but we've got so many more so much more kind of like deeply personal vehicles to deliver information that you can take at any time, and get feedback, and ask questions, so it's I think it's a strange thing. I think that's kind of what, one of the things I was talking about when we started our conversation about that kind of academic focus is still anchored in almost kind of like the PhD thesis, that it's, these are kind of like, they're like magical theses, and kind of, unless you have one of those, a lot of doors went open.
But how do we really know who you are?
Yeah.
You haven't shown us your papers.
Exactly.
It's weird. It's a strange world.
Cool. Well, Aiden, I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been a great crack chatting to you. And again, fantastic book. Really enjoyed it. Got a lot from it, and I know it's going to change my. It actually already did today. I'll tell you when we finish recording. I'll tell you. But it's already kicked in.
It likes that.
Yeah. So best place to find you. I'll leave all the links in the show notes for everybody. And thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Well, that was ace. I really, really enjoyed that show. Aiden, that was an awesome chat. I really appreciate your time. I've already incorporated some of the techniques mapped out in 6 ways into my own praxis, and it's immediately changed something quite significant for me. Spirits I assumed to be working with, well, after a bit of pendulum divination, that turned out not to be the case. And I've repeated it quite a few times, and it's been consistent in its response, which can often be the case. For those of you who haven't used pendulums or are not familiar with the practice, give it a try. It's quick and it's very effective. I've been using one for coming up to 30 years, and it's rarely, if ever, has let me down. Anyway, apart from that, be sure to check out the links to Aiden's work in the show notes. It's awesome. He's got some great stuff there. That was it. That's the show for now. Talk soon.